All right, we got to validation. Validation in ASP.NET Core is exactly like ASP.NET MVC5. So here, first we check if model state is valid. If it's not, we're going to return bad request and put model state object in the response. So basically, when we send a request to this endpoint, as part of model binding, where ASP.NET maps the request data to this vehicle resource object, it also looks at any data annotations we have applied on the properties of this class. For example, in our contact resource class, we have applied two data annotations on the name property. So ASP.NET is going to validate our object against these attributes, and if it's not valid, model state.isValid will return false. Now, by adding this model state in the response, we return all the validation errors to the client, and then on the client side, we display these validation errors to the user. Now, one thing that a lot of my students have been confused about is that in my Entity Framework course, I encourage them to prefer Fluent API over data annotations. So the question I get a lot is, Mosh, if I don't use data annotations, how can I validate my model? Well, you need to realize that here we're talking about two different things. When I talk about Fluent API, I'm talking about our domain model. So in our domain classes, I would prefer to use Fluent API because we cannot do everything with data annotations. Here's one example of that in our VGOT-DB context. So you saw that we could not create composite primary keys using data annotations. So we implemented that using Fluent API. Now, as our application grows, you will encounter more scenarios where data annotations has limitations. So then you need to use Fluent API. So what I want you to pay attention to here is that we use Fluent API to override the default conventions that come with Entity Framework. These conventions determine how our domain classes map to our database tables. So that's Fluent API. Now, back in our contact resource class, here we are dealing with an API resource. This is not a domain model. Here we are not dealing with Entity Framework. And we use data annotation here to implement validation. The same is true if you're using the view model pattern. So in my ASP.NET MVC5 course, I talked about the view model pattern. These are the objects that we use as the input to our actions, or we use them while rendering Razor views. So once again, if you're using a view model, that's the input to your application. And there you need to use data annotations to implement validation. So this is how we implement validation. Now this validation is basically input validation. We want to make sure that the object that comes to this action has the right data, all the required properties have a value, and if they're a string, we want to make sure their length does not exceed beyond a certain number of characters. If they're numeric, we want to make sure that their values are within a given range, and other scenarios like that. But in more complex domains, we have a different kind of validation, which I call business rule validation. So let's say the user has a quota to create new vehicles per day. For example, let's imagine we don't want to give our users the ability to list more than 5 vehicles per day. In scenarios like that, perhaps we need to go to the database, bring some objects, look at a few properties, and using a few conditional statements, determine if the input is valid or not. For that kind of scenario, we don't use data annotations. Data annotations is purely for input validation. For business rule validation, we do something like this. If, like here we're going to have a condition, for now let's just imagine true. This could be a complex conditional statement. Then we're going to add an error to our model state. Add model error. First, we specify a key, which is the property that caused this validation error. And whatever that key is going to be, then we add the actual error message. And once again, we return bad request with our model state. So this is how we implement business rule validation. Now in this simple application, we don't have any scenarios like that, so I'm going to delete this. Now let's test the result. So here's the body of our request. First, I'm going to delete this model ID. Let's see what happens. Send. So we got a 500 internal server error. And here you can see the actual error. So we have a SQL exception that is coming from our SQL server. the insert statement conflicted with the foreign key, train, vehicles, models, model ID. So because we did not set the model ID here, the default value was 0. And when saving the changes, SQL Server could not find a record in the models table with ID 0. We need to associate this record with a vehicle record, right? Now, in this case, we have a couple of options. If you're building a public API, we want to tell the consumer of our API that they have not sent a valid model ID. So whether they exclude model ID or send an invalid ID, we're going to send them a friendly error message. To implement that, we will do something like this. Model context dot models. We don't have this DB set. So let's go to our DB context. Here I'm going to add another DB set of model and call it models. Okay. Now we can query, we can find a model, or we can use find async. And here we pass the primary key, which comes from our vehicle resource object here. So vehicle resource dot model ID. Now, if model is null, you want to add a validation error here, add model error. The property name is model ID, and the error message is invalid model ID. Finally, return bad request with model state. Okay. Actually, I forgot to put await here. Now save. Let's send the request one more time. Okay, and here's the response. We got 400 error, bad request. And in the body of the request, you see we have this object. And in this object, for each property, we have an array of errors. Now for this application, I see this as an overkill because the client of this API is our vehicle form that we built with Angular. So technically, we should not send an invalid model ID because what the user selects from a dropdown list comes from the server. So I see this as some extra code that is creating noise without adding much value. Now you may argue that this actually makes it easier to debug the application if something goes wrong. We know exactly why. We sent an invalid model ID. And that's kind of a valid argument. So I leave it up to you to choose what approach you prefer. Now back in our request object, I'm going to add model ID one more time. I don't worry about is registered because if we don't supply a value, by default, it will be false. Now let's see what happens if we exclude the name property from our contact object. Send. Okay, we got a friendly error. The name field is required. Now I put this name back. What if I totally exclude this contact object? Let's see what happens. We got a 500 error. So we got a SQL exception, cannot insert the value null into column contact name. Now, ideally, this should not happen. We should tell the client that they have not sent the contact property. So I'm going to go to vehicle resource. Here's the contact property. I'm going to apply the required attribute here. Let's test it. Okay, send. And here's the response. Beautiful. The contact field is required. So I put it back here. And finally, we have this features property. Now, if we exclude this, nothing is going to happen. That basically means this vehicle doesn't have any standard features. Now, we could implement a custom validator to make sure that there is at least one object in this collection. Another topic for discussion is what will happen if I send invalid IDs here. Again, we can treat this the same way we treated model ID. So if you're building a public API, we would write code like this. But again, in this application, writing all this extra code is just going to make this action really, really fat. And given that the client of this API is our Angular form, we shouldn't really send invalid IDs. So the only way an invalid ID is sent to the server is when a malicious user, a hacker, tries to manipulate this API. And in that case, when they're in the production environment, they're just going to get an internal server error without the exception details. So that's why I think this code is extra noise, and I'm going to delete it. So this is all about validation. Next, we're going to create a new action to update a vehicle.